Hey everyone, and welcome to PowerPoint 10. This PowerPoint is going to be about American beliefs, the French and Indian War, the Proclamation of 1763, and Pontiac's War. So, as we get into our slides, we're going to have a lot of information, so make sure you're taking good notes and you're writing all this stuff down into your spiral. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is American beliefs. So as the colonies are starting to grow and they're becoming successful and they're doing good things, the colonists were starting to branch out into how they wanted their societies and their culture. So colonists valued education. New England and Pennsylvania set up schools to make sure people could read the Bible. So oftentimes education was only given to those of the upper class. But they wanted everyone, all their citizens, to be able to read the Bible. So education became more valued at this time. Next, we have the Great Awakening, was when the ministers called for a return to stronger faith of earlier days. So this inspired greater religious freedom and the formation of new types of churches. So as early on, a lot of these colonies were founded as a basis of a way to escape religious persecution. But over time, religion kind of fell back in importance. And so the Great Awakening was a way for people to step back up and start to value their religion and get back into church. So established churches declined. So big churches, the big, huge churches, kind of started to not be as valued. And the colonists started creating their own smaller churches or having their own local beliefs. Next, we have the Enlightenment, was the idea that knowledge, reason, and science could improve society. This promoted freedom of thought and expression, equality, and popular government. So this was the thought of how does everything work around us? As citizens in the new colonies, they wanted to know things like, maybe how the world works, why there's seasons, why there's stars, what do the stars mean, why does everything change through, and this was how they reached out. They wanted to emphasize more science as they developed their colonies. And then lastly here it's talking about the freedom of press. What freedom of press addresses the idea that newspapers were often censored. So today, pretty much you can print or you can say, newspapers or newscasters, news channels can print or talk about an individual in belief that they have some type of validity or truth to their assumption of what they're saying. So when they report on something, they have the right to talk about an individual without their permission. That's called freedom of press. The Zenger trial established that people could publish facts that were true. So and where does that really lie? It's kind of blurred today, but back then it was, if somebody said something or if there was a disagreement with what a higher level person thought, it could be published in the newspaper without repercussions. All right, our next slide is talking about the French and Indian War. So, the French and the British were arguing over the Ohio River Valley because the area was rich in natural resources. The Ohio River Valley is kind of near the Great Lakes region. And the French traded with the Native Americans in the region, and the British believed the land was theirs. So they had conflicting views. The French actually got along with the Native Americans fairly well. They didn't necessarily want to take their land. They just wanted to trade with them and share the land. The British moved in and said, we want this land. It's ours. We deserve it. The British won the war because the the French had more Native American allies because the natives knew the British wanted their land, and the French just wanted to trade. So, just like I said, the British didn't care anything about the Native Americans, but the French were there kind of more like an ally to the Native Americans. The British won the war because the British Prime Minister sent more troops. The British then took Quebec and Montreal. Quebec and Montreal are located in Canada, that were like present-day Canada. And so not only did they take the Ohio River Valley, they also took up into Canada, the British did. So the war had many effects. France gave up Canada and lands east of the Mississippi River. So in the Ohio River Valley, along the east side of the Mississippi River, France did control that, and they controlled Canada. Well, this war resulted in them giving up their rights to the land. So now Britain controlled all that. Spain gave Florida to Britain, and Spain got in return the lands west of the Mississippi River. So like where we live and in Texas and all those different places all now belonged to Spain. And Spain and Britain became the most powerful European countries in North America. The natives were now forced to pay higher prices and deal with Europeans settling on their land without paying for it. So it was bad for the Native Americans that the British won. But now the British had control of a lot more land. All right, so Pontiac's War and the Proclamation of 1763. So as the Native Americans are getting pushed out of their land, they're not getting paid for it, and the British are basically just taking it. It kind of creates this animosity between the Native Americans and the British, and so a war broke out. Pontiac's War occurred when the Chief Pontiac captured British forts and outposts. Many settlers were killed on the frontier. Okay, so the frontier being kind of unsettled land where maybe just a few people live. So the Native Americans killed some of the settlers. This created the Proclamation of 1763, when King George said colonists could not settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. All right, so if we look at our map over here, the darker pink or almost red color here is the colonies themselves, the original colonies. They were established, they had lots of people in them, and were living there. And then you have the light pink, okay, and you kind of see a line where there's kind of some words along the line there on the west side of the dark colonies there. That's where the Proclamation of 1763 started. That's the Appalachian Mountains. The king said you cannot settle on the other side or in the Appalachian Mountains. So everything that is a light pink color, the king said you couldn't settle. You can't settle on that land. And then everything that's in yellow there was controlled by Spain. So that part couldn't be settled anyway, but the light pink is where the king said you couldn't settle. Well, this caused the colonists to believe their freedoms were limited. They distrusted the large number of British troops. So because the king is an ocean away, they don't understand why he's limiting where they can settle. And it's kind of making them angry. They don't feel like that's just to be able to tell them when and where they can settle. And even though it could be dangerous from the Native Americans, they didn't care. This was kind of the beginning of where you're going to start to see the animosity that's created between the British and the American colonists because of the limitations that are put on the colonists by the British Parliament and King. All right, so next we have our vocabulary. We have militia, which is a military force made up of ordinary citizens. And the ordinary citizens are usually people who do not have any background of training as a soldier or anything. And so as we get closer to the American Revolution, you will find out that the soldiers that fight for the American colonies in the American Revolution are militia. They are ordinary citizens. Next, we have the Iroquois Confederacy. It was a group of Native American nations joined together under one general government. As the Native Americans are figuring out that they have to join forces in order to stand up to the colonists in Britain, they are deciding to create one group to try to create a unified force. And then last, we have alliance, which is a partnership. Most of you already probably know what a partnership or an alliance is. that's pretty much it for this week. Just, again, guys, make sure you are taking good notes and you are putting these in your spiral. You'll have a big test coming up in a couple of weeks. It's going to be pretty difficult if you don't have notes. So make sure you are keeping good notes.